All right, I would like to call to order the Finance and Personnel meeting for Tuesday, May 18th. Roll call, please.
Tracy Fluke. Here. Tom Selk.
Here.
Allison Brunette. Here. Allison Williams.
Here.
And Chris Serbel is excused.
Please stand for the pledge.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, action on the agenda to approve.
So move.
Second. Oh, I can't second.
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Action on the minutes from the Finance and Personnel regular meeting on March 16th.
Motion to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right. Comments from the public. Seeing that we have no public that I am aware of, we will move on to the action items. 7A, considering discuss act on ordinance 05-2-2021, creating section 2-3-539, Village Manager, Chapter 2, Administration, Article 3, Officers and Employees of the Village of Ashwaubenon Municipal Code.
Thank you, Ms. Chairwoman. In your packet is a draft ordinance for what will be a section titled Village Manager. This is essentially kind of a boilerplate template for what other communities will be using for what would be typically a village, town, or city administrator position. And it basically provides the authorities and responsibilities of my position. In looking through the village code, I'm the only appointed position that did not have a declaration within the village's code of ordinances. It was an item that was identified in a previous study that was completed back as early as 2009 that indicated the village manager. At that time, it was titled something differently. It was the Administrative Services Director. Should have a section of code that identifies the position's responsibilities and authorities. The slight changes from the boilerplate template for this particular ordinance relate specifically to the village president role. Here in Ashwaubenon, the village president is what would be, I guess, deemed a strong village president, where they have very specific home rule executive authorities that are also included in Chapter 2 of our municipal ordinances. And that's related specifically to a referendum that was conducted decades ago that established that additional executive authority within the village president. It should be noted that under Wisconsin state statutes, specifically Chapter 64.15, there is a provision in that statute that allows a municipality like a village to create what's called a village manager plan. And that village manager plan effectively provides significant executive authority to the village manager position, much like a city manager would in a council manager form of government. This particular ordinance does not indeed create that additional authority because Ashwaubenon, through referendum, has established that strong executive through the village president. It just so happens that the village of Ashwaubenon has elected to title my position village manager, but it does not carry that same authority that's vested in 64.15. In order to gain that authority for that position, it would have to go through a process called a charter ordinance amendment, which would also require a referendum by the voters. So it's just more or less kind of more nomenclature and naming than anything else. It does not provide or give any additional authority to my particular position. So with that, I'll answer any questions that the committee may have.
Having said that about the village manager position and the title, would it be wise for us to have the title be village administrator versus village manager, just to make it clear that the position is functioning as an administrator? My only concern is Wisconsin statutes, as a village manager, as that title, do allow for additional duties or authority, even though I know our ordinances, like you said, the village president is the strong village president and the village manager follows a role similar to an administrator. If something would happen or occur, would our village manager end up in a problem strictly because of the title? Would we be better off and safer for us to be administrator because that's what this ordinance is laying out, an administrator role?
And Mary can provide a little bit more history on the reasoning behind the village administrator versus village manager title. No, in talking with Tony Walkowitz, our village attorney, we did not feel that it would create any conflicts just by title alone, primarily for two reasons. One, the village president role as a chief executive officer is identified within municipal code and through charter ordinance. And that's clearly identified in our municipal code. So we certainly won't have any conflicts there. And the elements that are within the chapter that's being proposed for committee recommendation tonight does not include any of the provisions that would be traditionally allowed under 64.15. It's again, it's a naming issue more than anything else. Would it create conflict by changing the position title to village administrator? No, it wouldn't. The ordinance wouldn't change. It would again just be a naming convention. But from what I understand, there may be a history behind why they did not go with a village administrator title versus a village manager, and maybe Mary can touch on that.
Many years ago, when the position was created, they did not want to use the terminology of village administrator because that also carries statutory duties. And because of the strong village president position, they didn't want people to think that they were going to have those authorities. When Mike was the village president and we were looking for a new village manager, that was when the title became village manager, because Steve's title, I believe, was Director of Administrative Services. And he felt that that wasn't a true reflection, so that's why the title then became village manager. So.
How difficult is it to change the job description, i.e. number 8 indicates serves as a personnel director, which it seems like we're heading the way of having a personnel person or an HR person. Is it still, how difficult is it to change the job description? Is it another statute change or is it just a modification?
No, I think the job description itself is a relatively easy change. Obviously, here in Ashwaubenon, generally speaking, it would come through committee. Committee would make recommendation, ultimate adoption from village board. Certainly more difficult to change an ordinance. So if this were to become adopted, then you'd have to go through that process again of providing that ordinance amendment, publication, posting, things of that nature. In particular, my recommendation would be for in a traditional administrator or manager role, you will serve as the personnel director, performing work at a very high level. In particular, just making sure that personnel files are kept in check. Individuals have a job description. Generally speaking, the manager oversees just kind of more performance management as a whole organizationally. Doesn't necessarily negate the need or the responsibility of a human resources professional to kind of handle the day-to-day operations, but the administrator manager role is predominantly focused on performance management and making sure that departments have the appropriate resources in place, both in human point of view as well as a material point of view. So that's why paragraph 8 here is included as that high-level overview for personnel director.
Okay, thank you.
If there are no further questions, I would make a motion to approve ordinance 05-2021, creating section 2-3-539 Village Manager, Chapter 2 Administration, Article 3 Officers and Employees of the Village of Ashwaubenon Municipal Code.
A second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. 7B, staff update on human resources consultant. Joel, back to you.
Okay, thank you, committee. Just wanted to give you a brief update because I know there's a significant interest from the committee about this human resources consulting work here at the Village of Ashwaubenon. So we did enter into an agreement a couple months ago with Human Resources Consulting LLC out of Green Bay. And since that time, we've begun the audit process that was included in their proposal. In fact, just this morning, I received a draft copy of that audit and have begun to kind of go through that. So I suspect that we will have somebody from that firm come to committee next month to provide more thorough update to the committee as to what we found. Just really quickly at a high level, I did go through the complete audit, and at this point, there is nothing that lawfully has to change. I know there was kind of this tiered system that they were going to look at. What are things that were non-compliance? What are some best practices? And then kind of what are some strategic projects that we want to entertain? So at this point, nothing has been deemed non-compliant or out of compliance, so that is good. But there are a number of items that they had identified as best practices. And so that I think that's a good sign. So nothing really dumpster fire worthy at this point, but certainly some opportunities to improve and grow. A couple of the strategic items that we'll begin to have them work on that we began with is just really kind of taking a look at current job descriptions. So they have put together kind of a template form that we'll begin to use. And prior to HR Consulting coming on board, I had all of our department directors put together and compile all of the job descriptions that report to each department supervisor and submit that to me. And so HR Consulting and I will be going through those and updating job descriptions to match that formal template. At some point, once that is completed, we will be bringing the full gamut of job descriptions through for review and approval by committee and board so that you can see that action. In addition to that, in particular with the changing ordinance update to the village manager, if that were to be adopted, then I have a duty and an obligation under the ordinance to provide an organizational review and present an updated or revised org chart that identifies and outlines where employees should be working and what tasks and responsibilities departments will have. And so we'll go through that process as well here shortly. One of the elements that was identified in the audit is our employee handbook, and there are a number of updates that need to occur in that handbook. So by and large, that is going to be probably our biggest and first project that we'll try to tackle right away. Our goal would be to have that completed sometime in the first quarter of next year. My initial intent would be to provide some employee engagement opportunities by maybe having a staff employee handbook review team that will not necessarily look to develop policy, but review policy as it's written to ensure that the interpretation of that policy is clear and accurate so that we don't enter into disputes with our employees about the interpretation of policy. What I'd eventually like to do once job descriptions are also complete is to review and revise a formal pay and wage classification system. At current, our pay and wage classification system is kind of hodgepodge and just a mishmash. I would like to make that a more formalized system to provide equity and fairness to our employee groups. And then ultimately, we want to establish and formalize strategies to improve our employee engagement and communication process. This also was identified as we were going through our strategic plan efforts, and that we need to do a more robust job in engagement and communication internally with our employees. So we'll work with HR Consulting to figure out some best practices for that as well. And then ultimately review and improve upon our employee performance evaluation and management system. And what we mean by that is just trying to align our performance management with our strategic plan that will ultimately be adopted here sometime midpoint this year. And we want to make sure that our goals for each individual employee line up with the strategic goals of the organization, both organizationally and then hopefully developmentally for the employee as well. Not on my list in the memo, but included in the audit that is certainly a worthwhile endeavor is to begin to work towards some type of succession planning as well. And part of that will tie into that organizational review. Ultimately, what I'd like to do within any organization is to develop this kind of two-deep leadership, if you will. So if somebody has to leave the organization for a variety of reasons, whether it be permanent or temporary, there's always another person to back that individual up to be able to handle those tasks in either interim or a permanent basis based on need. And so that succession planning will take a look at not only that two-deep leadership component, but also where are we at with tenured employees based on age and expectancy of work remaining from that individual within the organization. So with that, everybody is very pleased. We do have in-person office hours for our HR consulting group. So they come in Mondays and Wednesdays, Monday mornings and Wednesday afternoons for a couple hours. And we have had some utilization from staff through that process. In particular, we've had some communications about, potentially a counseling incident with an employee, as well as maybe some hiring practices for some future employment opportunities that may become available here at the village. So again, with that, very pleased with their progress to date and find that at this point, it's been a valuable resource for the village. So I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
All right. I was going to ask about the office hours, but you touched on that. So given there's no other questions, there's no motion because that was just information. So we will move on to 7C, investment policy update. Greg, you're up.
Thank you. So annually, I'll come before the committee and present the investment policy. This year, it did have a little bit different review than normal. We had new auditors come in. They have seen the policy, and I believe they may, when they come to present on the audit, if they have any concerns, they would present at that time, but they've not had any concerns. It's a fairly standard policy, consistent across the state. The one change that I did make in this policy was just kind of an edit replace with some of the position changes from clerk treasurer to clerk and finance director to finance director / treasurer. So that's the only change in here. So if you have any other questions or concerns, I can take those now.
Yeah, so why was the village clerk still listed? Is that part of their responsibility in the investment policy? I thought they were going to kind of split off, and now you're going to do the treasurer versus the city. And I know the city clerk used to do both, and now I don't see that, but maybe they do.
Well, the challenge that we have is separation of duties. So we don't have a second. The clerk still acts as a second name on our bank accounts and other areas as an acting officer of the village. If we didn't have that, it would just be me alone on the policy, on our banking, et cetera, et cetera. So I think from an audit perspective, they've been really keying in on separation of duties and backups and having some checks and balances in place. If we didn't use the clerk, I would recommend that we have some other officer at the village to be in that role. I feel the clerk is a kind of more of a neutral position. Many communities have a clerk treasurer, clerk, merged with other roles. So that's why that would be kept in there.
I agree with the separation of duties, and it just, I was just wondering why it was there. And it makes sense to have two people sign and have somebody else look at it. It's definitely a good thing
Our
to do.
clerk, even prior to the roles, and originally not that long ago, it was a clerk, there was a treasurer, there was a finance director.
Yeah.
The clerk has always been a signature on our checks, on our payments going out the door, and has always been a officer on this policy. So it's kind of going back to the way it was. We're still down to two positions, just moving the treasurer responsibilities over to the finance director.
Tom, under the statutes too, clerks do have some fiduciary responsibility, and so this complements that statutory provision that clerks do play a role as far as handling claims, payments, against the village, and so having that clerk being that second signatory, that's an appropriate place for that position.
Okay, good, thank you.
Is that a common practice now that our clerk is appointed versus elected, correct? Is that a common practice to not have an elected official as a signer on financial accounts, but to have 2 staff members?
I don't know if I know the answer to that. I could tell you that it probably becomes a challenge in communities that wouldn't have elected officials. So we would have no other, it would have to be a board member essentially as an elected official to be on there, which I think would be unusual.
I just wasn't sure if maybe it would be like the clerk and the village president, or the village president and the finance director. I think that's maybe one thing that's shifted with that clerk role shifting to an appointed role, is now that it's 2 appointed staff members versus 1 elected, 1 staff member.
I would say that it's kind of a mixed bag. Some organizations will have at least 1 elected official, in particular like the village president or mayor or town chairperson. That's certainly common, but oftentimes you find it where you only have the 2 signatures. As long as they're separated like we have, that's sufficient. The reason why I would say more municipalities are going to 2 signatures, primarily just because of ease of access versus having 3 and then having to wait and go through that whole process. But as long as you have that full separation of duties, generally speaking, the auditors are okay with that. And certainly it's going to be preference too. So if the executive wants to have the ability to review all checks before they go out, then having that 3rd signature line is important.
Any other questions?
I move we approve or accept the investment policy as submitted.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. On to 7D, investment report for information only. Back to Greg.
Thank you. So just giving an update to where we're at with our investments. This is specifically tied around what we have out with Associated Investment Trust Company, or excuse me, Associated Trust Company. The portfolio itself has not changed, other than they have the ability to buy and make modifications to some of the investments as is laid out in our policy. For the most part, this policy has dropped, obviously, with the economy, but we've been able to maintain, better overall results than what we would see at, obviously, in a general checking. The local government investment pool was down to about 5 basis points for a while, and then even in the CD market. So the long-term impact here is, we're still, the life of this portfolio is still over 10% return on investment. I would suspect that we may see a few months yet of lower, but as the economy improves, there's a bit of a lag, and then this will kick back in, and we should see some better results as the economy recovers and the markets recover. But overall, the policy itself or the investment portfolio itself has not changed. I included a copy if you're interested. There's a lot of investments, like when we bond, for our own borrowings, we put out village bonds. We have a lot of bonds in other municipalities within this portfolio. So you get that revolving impact as stuff comes off, things come on with different interest rates, and that's where you see your fluctuations. So it's just information only.
I have a question about the investment summary. The general fund has increased slightly over last year. Or is that, excuse me, even with COVID, it's surprising. You think the revenues would be down, and, we're going to use some of that for the budget shortfall too. Is that included in this yet or not?
So the reason, again, why these are, when you think about if you're an investor right now, especially last year, where might you put your money? You put it in government bonds because they're about as safe as they can be, and they're fairly guaranteed investment. So that's where we benefit versus, just going and getting treasuries or something across out there. So, to see a positive return, I mean, overall, the net change rate of return is only 6 basis points. So it's 0.06%. The interest alone is over 2%. And then there's all those other pieces. There's non-cash activity, unrealized gain losses. That's that in-between activity between when bonds are priced out, when they're sold, when they retire, and then when they're buying. So there's these, it's a little bit confusing. And if you ever want, we could have a representative come and explain it in greater detail. But overall, this investment portfolio weathers these storms better because it's government bonds mostly that are in here, and they're much more, you're not going to get 20% returns on them, but you're going to have a safe, consistent return on your investment over time. So I don't know if I answered your question.
I guess I'm surprised that, the revenue is still there. You would think that our general fund would go down because of COVID. That as an outside person saying, hey, why isn't it going down? I know you're talking about the investment side, but the point is the revenue can't be in there either.
Well, they're kind of two different animals, if you will. So you're talking about, yes, our budget, we budgeted a deficit because we're short on revenues. Part of that would be, investment revenues are lower than what they normally would be, but your revenues are coming from multiple sources. The pieces that were hit the hardest would have been, what we saw, room tax revenues, temporary revenues. It didn't really affect the bond market as far as when we went our last bonding last year, sold out really quick. People flock to these investments because they know they're safe. So it's kind of apples and oranges in some way. Yeah, I guess in the long run, if you had consistent revenue problems and consistent deficits, it might impact your own bonds that are out there. But again, this portfolio is made up of multiple communities people are still borrowing. Now, they might be borrowing more because they don't have the cash now, so they have revenue shortfall, so they might be bonding more than they normally would have at lower rates. But yes, over time, maybe a 5-10 year run of that would maybe see a greater impact. But I think the thought was recover from the COVID issue. We've seen a lot of communities get funds from the feds. How that's going to play out over time, we don't know. What that's going to do in interest rates, I don't think are going to be going up anytime soon. But overall, communities are recovering better than maybe they thought they would. But the revenue stream that you're talking about for our general fund is not really tied to this directly, in the fact that I might actually have to borrow more to cover for the lost revenues if I'm another community, and then other people are buying those bonds, just like this portfolio is going out and buying bonds as well. So if we had to bond more to make up for lost revenue, people would be buying our investments for their portfolios. So I don't.
So if we have a budget shortfall, where does the money come from? I'm just trying to get
right now it's coming from our fund balance. We dipped into our general fund balance.
So that would go down potentially.
Yeah. And our general fund balance was
that's where I'm going.
Yeah, our general fund balance we talked was about 34%. Our policy says to be 20%. And by dipping in, we're only going to go down about 31%. So I don't think, you don't want to be going in your fund balance year after year.
Right.
But
yeah, that short term, we took it from the fund balance in this case.
So I think one thing too that we'll see once the final audit report comes back is that with CARES Act funding that we received last year, we in fact had a very positive fund balance for year end for fiscal year 2020 that didn't require us to dip into our fund balance per se because of a loss of revenues. And then we're not necessarily experiencing some of those intended shortfalls yet in 2021. Now, it's certainly possible that we may, but with the additional ARPA funds that are going to be coming to us, we can utilize those ARPA funds to offset any of those revenue shortfalls that we anticipated for fiscal year 2021. So thanks to the federal government, certainly with that additional infuse of cash, it has made our operating budgets balance out. In fact, come out ahead because of other savings as well. We had less overtime expenses last year. We had a number of other expenses that we just didn't realize last year because of the slowdown.
Yeah, because the portfolio is very conservative, which is great. I mean, I'm not knocking the portfolio. I'm just trying to find out the other side of it. So, thank you.
Ultimately, we just did not realize the shortfalls that we had anticipated last year due to the pandemic, is really what it comes down to.
Good.
Greg, is it typical to be this diversified in these funds? Like, there's just tons of different investments. Is that pretty typical?
Yes. Yeah, in the type of investments and in the maturities of the investments, so that you don't have spikes.
So it's
Yeah.
very interesting, the different places that were invested, from Texas to Alabama to Wisconsin. It's just like all over.
Right.
Very interesting. Thanks for sharing this.
Sure.
All right. If there are no other questions, 8A, annual distribution of public officials and employees code of ethics. Annually, I believe we are required to distribute this to all serving members. So this is your annual distribution. Joel, anything to add to that? Read it over, everyone. All right, number 9, items for next agenda. If there are any, please call the village office. Otherwise, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second.
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We are adjourned.
This conference is no longer being recorded.
See, exactly like Mary does it. I just copy her.
You killed it, 32 minutes.
I've only heard it for 3 years in a row now. I got it down like that.
You did good, girl.
You can keep this one.
Okay.
I won't do anything.
What is the status of that public safety pre-employment? I know the board tabled it, or what? Where does it say?